If I sat here before you and I opened a bottle of water, imagine what it would be like if someone told you that this bottle of water didn't exist. He would tell you that it is just a figment of your imagination. So likewise, if I were to drop some poison into this water, he would tell you that it cannot harm you because it does not exist. Would you drink the water? Would you refuse to take a drink but then still try to argue that yes, the bottle is a figment of your imagination despite the fact that we can both see it? Unless you spend too much time online, these may seem like ridiculous questions. But unfortunately, there is a parallel to this in philosophy in which some people consider this a genuine debate, the question of free will. Now, if you're a reasonable person, you may ask yourself, what question of free will? I make choices every day. I clearly have free will. And I would agree with you, but as we're going to cover here, there is a very loud and very confident minority that, as per our analogy, would tell you that this bottle of water doesn't exist, and that your experiences of your own free will are just an illusion. There are those who reject free will, and generally these people are going to be called determinists. They believe that all of the choices we make are predetermined by external causes. And I think many of us have an inclination to one degree or another that this is false, but I think we forget just how dangerous this ideology actually is. And I don't just mean something like the lack of drive that one may experience from having a lack of self-determination. As an extension of defunct schools of thought like positivism, determinism can be said to be at the core of many of humanity's worst social beliefs. But I think that's a video for another day because we already have enough on our hands with answering the simple question, why is determinism wrong? Well, first to answer that, I think it's helpful to understand what I mean by determinism, because there are technically different kinds. In discussions of free will, terms like determinism, indeterminism, libertarianism, compatibilism, and incompatibilism will often pop up. While it would be difficult to comprehensively outline all of the competing beliefs and overlap between these ideologies, the simplest model to represent this argument is the scale from so-called hard determinism to strong free will. On this scale, a belief like compatibilism can be considered a form of determinism, because compatibilism simply refers to a group of beliefs in which free will and determinism are compatible. Generally, this is someone who believes in some variant of a deterministic world, that is to say that our choices are either greatly influenced or caused by external factors, but that person also believes that people have some moral agency such that they can be held accountable for their actions. Regardless of what you believe, however, if you think that people have some agency or that deterministic principles have some wiggle room, you would likely be classified as a soft determinist. Soft determinism has some truth to it. Obviously, we live in a world where our environment clearly has some effect on us, and we live in a world that is mostly governed by deterministic principles like physical causality. And as such, the question of how much these principles govern our universe is a matter of honest and intellectual inquiry, as the debate between soft determinism and free will is still very much ongoing. So this video is not targeted at anyone who is a soft determinist, or anyone who doesn't subscribe to the most extreme forms of free will. When I say determinism is a flawed ideology, I am talking about hardline determinists, or at least that's what I will be talking about for the majority of this video. While this is by no means an official classification, I think we can generally split free will deniers into three groups. I'm just going to call these groups true determinists, pedantic determinists, and edgy teens. I'm off to a good start, huh? Not making anyone mad with this video. Let's start with the only group that I'm not really even sure classifies as a determinist. These are people who make arguments about necessary ability. They claim that free will cannot exist because our ability to act does not enable us to act freely, and as such, our will is limited. For example, if you wanted to choose to stand up and levitate, you could not because you cannot levitate. You do not have free choice, or at least so they would say. I'm not going to spend too long on this group, because as the name should imply, I don't think that this is a position that I really need to refute for anyone who has made it out of their teenage years and gained the intellectual maturity to realize that just blatantly and intentionally misrepresenting someone's position is not an intelligent argument that needs to be addressed. Free will means free will, not free ability. Ability and will are not the same thing. So the mild restriction of ability does not imply the complete restriction of will. This position just seems to be predicated on not understanding the concept of choice, which is frankly a trend in most determinist positions, so let's quickly cover that. Oxford defines free will as the power of acting without the constraint of necessity or fate, the ability to act at one's own discretion, which is where some people point out without the constraint of necessity. But Oxford defines necessity as the fact of being required or indispensable, and defines required as officially compulsory or otherwise considered essential. indispensable. This must mean that either the original definition can be interpreted as the power of acting without the constraint of being compelled, which obviously does not imply the argument of necessity as some make it, or here, at best, it would mean without the constraint of that which is essential or indispensable, which also doesn't really fit the argument. And also, even if this was not the implication of this definition, it's also likely just the case that since this is a dictionary, it is using a very colloquial definition of free will. If I give you the option of do what I say or die, you can say that I didn't really give you a choice, but technically I did. This phrase that you have no choice or no free will in these instances, that's just hyperbolic. For example, Oxford has a definition for the word literally that means used for emphasis, or in other words, not literally. You can't make philosophically grounded arguments based on self-contradicting definitions like this. And so I don't want to get too sidetracked discussing definitions, because I think we can ultimately concede that the label for an ideological group is either going to be decided by consensus, since it is a matter of language, or by those who hold the belief, since it is also their right to decide what they believe. And in that, since those who accept the existence of free will make up the overwhelming majority, with the majority of philosophers, 59% identifying as compatibilists, only 11% identifying as determinists, and only 15% of psychology students identifying with hardline determinism, it's clear that we get to explain what we mean when we say free will and not you. So free will does not mean the ability to act on the desire to choose, it is simply the choice itself. As the compatibilist David Hume once pointed out as well, free will is defined as a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. So this necessity of ability position could only ever advocate for weak will, not the complete rejection of it. Because even if you ignore everything I just said, remember what I said earlier. The limited restriction of ability does not imply the complete restriction of free will. Even if we were to treat will and ability as the same thing, it would only follow that the limited restriction of ability implies a limited restriction of will. So long as you can choose to do one thing or not do that same thing, you have free choice. The only way free will can be said to not exist is if even the choice to act or not act is not allowed, and all actions are compelled by external events. This is why the rejection of free will necessitates determinism, although this is a point we'll have to come back to later because there are those who will try to argue otherwise. For example, some misinterpret the definition of free will to mean choice completely devoid of influence. I'm sure this is a position that someone somewhere may hold, especially the more theologically grounded indeterminists who believe in absolute free will, but this is not the definition of free will. If it was, compatibilists, who again make up the majority of philosophers, would be wrong. But as the majority, they are the ones who get to decide what the definition is. Go read Plato, who believed in free will, but believed that people had to cultivate their virtues and learn to overcome their baser instincts. Go ask anyone who believes in free will what free will means. It does not necessarily mean choice without influence. Too often, free will is rejected under false pretenses, and this is what I mean by pedantic determinists. For example, in the past, when I argue determinists, I am often met with people claiming that I do not understand what determinism is. I've had people tell me that choices are made in deterministic frameworks, and that determinism just means that those people made those choices because of the events leading up to the choice that influenced them, but this doesn't mean that they didn't have the choice. The issue with this is, again, as the name should imply, this is pedantic, and as such it doesn't truly lead to the rejection of free will. It is the rejection in name only, because it doesn't matter what you call it, choice, decision, or free will. If I say that people have free will because they make their own choices, and you turn around and say, no they don't, yes they make choices of their own volition, but these choices were predetermined, you aren't actually challenging my belief. I believe people make choices of their own volition. That is what free will is. So you are either a compatibilist in denial, where maybe you just don't know what compatibilism is and think you have to reject free will because you accept some form of determinism, or you're just a pseudo-intellectual, like you just want to believe that you're so smart for understanding this cool nihilistic perspective that simpletons like us don't understand, but we do. We know that you cannot commit to full-blown determinism, because if a person doesn't really have free will, then that person cannot be said to be culpable of any actions. And this is not only undesirable, but it's inapplicable to the point where it alone probably disproves determinism. Many compatibilists accept free will for this very reason. So ultimately, giving any agency to the individual, such as moral culpability, is affirming that people have at least weak free will. Pedantic determinists are just soft determinists and compatibilists who are too stubborn to admit that their position does not actually reject free will. They reject it in name only by believing in everything that is true under the free will position, but conceptualizing it and naming it differently. The only position, then, that can reject free will is the true determinist position. For reasons I have laid out up to now, free will can only fail to exist if a person's actions must have a material cause. But this leads us to ask one all-important question. Why should we believe that? Why should we believe a person's will terminates outside of himself? Well, as far as I can tell, this always just boils down to one premise: that all events have a cause. So if it can be proven that not all events have a cause, then there is no reason to assume that free will does not exist. And it's actually incredibly easy to prove that not all things are caused. I mean, think about it. The series of events leading up to now either goes on forever or it doesn't. If it doesn't go on forever, then there is a first causer, an event or being which itself was uncaused. This would mean that a causality exists. So if we do not want that to be the case, it must be that all events have no first cause. But if this were the case, then I could ask you what caused the series of events, to which you would be forced to reply, nothing. If a series can have a beginning, then that series has a first uncaused event. If the series has no beginning, then that series is uncaused. A causality exists. You can argue that I'm just twisting language when I conceptualize the entire series as a thing in and of itself that needs a cause. But if we're going down that path, then we have to concede that the determinist position still fails because it, likewise, twists language to suit its needs. The argument that every event needs a cause is a carefully selected half-truth. The statement should be more like every physical event that follows Newtonian principles has a cause. And in this, whether the human consciousness is physical or follows Newtonian laws comes into question. Although, frankly, it's probably a question that we don't even need to answer. The belief that the mind is physical rather than metaphysical almost always, if not exclusively, comes from the baseless rejection of metaphysics. And even more so, we can see the true motivations at play here when we ask why the assumption is made that human consciousness, if it is a material thing, abides by simple causality, when we know that other scientific phenomena does not. A lot of things, for example on the quantum level, like superpositions, seem uncaused and even random. And it's been a while since I studied quantum physics, but the Higgs boson field gives particles their mass, right? So if that is an instantiator of mass, what instantiates its ability to give mass? If we eventually get to a point where there is a first causer, then why do you assume that consciousness cannot be a fundamental force that instantiates choice? Either a causality exists and a choice can be an a-causal event, or you reject my argument under the guise that I cannot group all events together without sufficient reason. But if you do that, then what is your reason to exclude choice from a-causal events without prior reason? The answer is, there is none. I know even people who aren't determinists will watch this video and think that I was being too confrontational at the beginning or throughout, but this really is just a juvenile ideology. There is no reason to assume that free will does not exist, because there isn't even a reason to assume that every event must have a cause. And this isn't just something that I've made up that hasn't yet withstood the test of time and the scrutiny of the philosophical community. Although they may give different arguments, this general premise is expressed by many philosophers. Hardline determinism is predicated on a lack of knowledge. It comes from a simplistic worldview where the only relationship two things can have is cause and effect. And you can say that this is demeaning to the few philosophers who oppose free will, or that I am cherry-picking free will philosophers, but take something that is a mainstay in determinism like Laplace's demon. This is a hypothetical where if an entity was all-knowing enough to know the position and momentum of every atom in the universe, it could predict all future events, including choices. This is basically tantamount to what we've been discussing all along, where determinists believe that all events, therefore, in a sense, are predetermined. The issue, however, with Laplace's demon becomes clear if we were to ask about a person's choices over two instances. In the first instance, let's assume that a person comes to a fork in the road, and we've calculated based on all prior events leading up to this choice that the person will take path A. If the person is unaware of this, he will take path A. However, what if in the second instance the person had made the same calculation, and knowing he would have taken path A, instead decided to take path B? What would stop him? An invisible deterministic force? I've never gotten an actual answer to this question. People will say that him knowing is a prior event that will change the outcome, but this is an insanely bad cop-out. We agree that in instance 1, before he was made aware, all prior events led to path A. You cannot add an event after all events have been tallied just because you don't like that this proves that he made a choice. Because, like, what does this rebuttal even mean? Are you saying that he is the event? His knowledge is the cause? Because again, it cannot just be all prior events that led to this, because if it is, the events had already been tallied. So if his awareness is the cause, then he is both the cause and the causer. That is called a free agent. He has free will. If, on the other hand, your challenge is just, well, there must be an event that led to him becoming aware of all prior events, then I have two very rhetorical questions. One, why must this be the case? You're basically just saying at this point that he must have been caused because determinism is true, and determinism can withstand my hypothetical because he must have been caused. That's a circular argument. You are just proving that your belief is baseless and you just want it to be true. But two, even if this somehow is the case, and he must be caused to become aware of all prior events, isn't he now a free agent? Does that not mean that free will exists? Maybe you could argue that it's only possible for all-knowing beings, but the assumption in that is that predictions cannot be rough or probabilistic. If deterministic principles act classically and can be calculated as Laplace says, then we can make approximations based on limited knowledge. I don't have to know the history of every atom in an apple to know that it will fall from a tree. In the same way, I don't need to know every prior event in the universe to know that a person from a family of alcoholics is likely prone to alcoholism. And this is why I mentioned earlier that the definition of free will does not exclude influence. If you go ask any person, the common sense understanding of free will is not that everyone can act on it. Self-determination has to be learned and practiced. You have to learn to overcome your bias and your base instincts. So this isn't just a hypothetical. This rebuttal to Laplace's demon is quite literally how free will works. And every counter to this rebuttal that I've experienced just seems to accuse me of assuming I am correct, when that is the very thing that free will deniers are doing. It's all just this circular argument where you assume that everything is predetermined, or even worse, you go off on random tangents that can't possibly justify your beliefs. For example, earlier I mentioned how some people would argue that I'm wrong when I claim that the denial of free will requires determinism to be true. As I've pointed out, classical determinism has been thoroughly debunked by recent scientific discoveries in the field of quantum mechanics, where it's clear that we do not live in a completely deterministic world. So in this, some people will say that my argument against classical determinism fails to disprove the rejection of free will, because free will could still cease to exist in a world with acausal events. And look, I'm trying to not raise my voice and still give a comprehensive rebuttal to this. But what is the basis for this? What is the basis for any of this? First of all, how do you differentiate this system from classical determinism? Sure, from a perspective prior to choice, we could say that it is indeterminate, but after random events have taken place and choices made, there is still clearly a series of events that led to a choice, is there not? After all, if a choice is not made by external causes, then it is made by the self, which makes it self-caused. Now, you could falsely argue that it is not indicative of free will, since it is random and therefore not self-caused. But this is, once again, an intentional misrepresentation of the free will position. If something is random, then it has no cause. So here we have a choice that terminates in the self and has no cause. That is indicative of strong free will, not no free will. The desire to say that randomness means no free will is just baseless. Likewise, once again, we run into this issue where determinists will just say, but what if what I want to be true is true? Because it could be the case that non-conscious events are acausal, but all conscious events are caused. Maybe this, maybe that, maybe this, that, and the other, because it's just all baseless. And the most frustrating part is that determinists are going to have the absolute goal to tell me that my beliefs are baseless. Oh yeah? Okay, tell me, why do we believe in quantum mechanics? Because we observed phenomena like the double slit experiment, right? So there you have it. Observation. We observed that the world does not operate by deterministic principles, just like we have observed that free will exists. I make choices every day. There are thousands of studies on the nature of free will and how to help people modify their behavior. We are constantly observing free will. And every time the question of free will pops up, I get someone who rightfully asks, what makes determinists believe that we will change our minds? Clearly, we are predetermined to believe this. And I wish I could remember the exact quote, but one time, some poor, indoctrinated, and delusional child came along and said something like this: choice doesn't exist. We are just presenting you with the conditions that will cause you to change. And this is something that they will say as if it is a choice that they make. As if that first comment isn't the end of the argument. Right there. Absolutely. You are hoping that I will see reason, but that insinuates I am capable of choosing what I believe. but you just want me to ignore that. You want me to ignore all of the flaws in your belief. You want me to ignore common sense, and you want me to ignore my own experiences of my own free will and dismiss them as an illusion. But I won't. You would sooner convince me that this bottle doesn't exist because it's the same flawed argument. If I never give you an answer as to how I know this bottle exists, you'll just continue to make baseless claims about how it could be an illusion or how it is an illusion, despite the fact that we can all see it. So someday, maybe I'll try in vain to prove that free will exists in a very comprehensive and extensive argument. But for now, it is as easy as this. Free will is as real as this bottle, and this bottle is as real as it gets. And I know that this is real, just like I know that I am awake right now. I am awake because there is a time when I know that I am asleep. Claiming that this is an illusion insinuates that there is something realer than this. But there's not. Even if we live in a simulation, our concept of what is real and what is not comes from this simulation. Free will is not an illusion because that insinuates that there is a greater standard of choice than the choices that we have. I chose to make this video. You chose to watch it. The only way you can deny that is by ignoring what we both accept to be true and by twisting words like choice and free will. But I think an honest person would have to ask himself, why? Why would you want to do that? Because you can't seriously convince yourself that you have no agency, and all of the choices you make are made for you by events beyond your control. But then act as though this must be the truth, that you yourself have objectively reasoned out as though you are a free agent. Ultimately, if we are caught up in some sort of illusion, how can you claim that this is an illusion, that you can see beyond the illusion, but at the same time that you can't? It's not some logical thing. It is a strictly emotional, preconceived notion where either someone is unable to understand a concept as simple as free will, but is too prideful to admit that, and as such doubles down on this myth, or it is people who know that they are in control of their actions and in control of their lives, but they don't want to take accountability for that. And that is incredibly dangerous.